I'm so happy to be able to begin this panel with you all this afternoon. Reverend Lawson, I'd like to start with you. In the past, you've expressed concern over the term the civil rights movement to describe the struggle for racial justice during the 1960s. Why do we need a better phrase to describe the struggle for justice, which took place in Nashville and across the South during that period?
Because civil rights movement, civil rights act are both primarily terms that come out of the politics of the United States. 1789, as we adopted the Constitution of the United States, most people, women, Indians, blacks, Spanish-speaking people in the territories did not have civil rights or human rights according to the Constitution, no matter the lofty position of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So Civil Rights Act of 1866, to the best of my knowledge, is the first time the term appears recognizing that all USA people did not have fundamental human rights, no matter our lofty documents. So what is called the Civil Rights Movement, which is primarily then a 20th century term, recognizes the organization of the Niagara Movement and the NAACP and the Urban League, and then the host of many issues that took place around the country, most of them unknown to us. But in the mid-20th century, there were 20 years in which Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. could put their name to 20 years of essentially nonviolent soul force action, in which literally actions took place in all of the states, though primarily in the southeastern part of the country, with what historian Vincent Hardy calls the Black Freedom Movement or the Black Justice Movement. So to just use the term civil rights movement allows, therefore, the system to name us. And the Nonviolent Movement of America is what the late Congressman John Lewis, named the Freedom Ride, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Nashville campaign, the Mississippi Summer, the Selma to Montgomery campaign. So many campaigns. I especially lift up what I like to call the Little Rock Nine campaign. They should not be relegated to the large omnibus term civil rights movement. We should speak specifically of the Little Rock Nine because they represent heroic stories of young people in high school who took every form of abuse without retaliation and instead cultivated their minds, developed their souls, emphasized the fact that they were on a crusade for equality and liberty and justice for all, and to not be able to therefore lift up these many different campaigns precisely is to not have, therefore, an essential awareness of the history from which we have come.
Thank you, Reverend Lawson. I'm moved by that, and I think that it speaks to not only the ways that naming the movement, the civil rights movement, can obscure some of the precious and seismic moments of the past, but also relegate the whole moment and the spirit behind the movement to the past when it's an ongoing exercise. And I think giving it a label in that way can sometimes be limiting in terms of how we understand the current urgency of exercises that began, before the 20-year period that you speak to about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and that extend very urgently into the present, and being led by some of the people on this panel today. And speaking to that point, everyone brings their own story to this fight for freedom. And this is a question for all the panelists. Was there a single event or a person who inspired each of you to take the personal risk for the collective good? And I will start with Angeline. Do you have a single person or event that catalyzed you in this work?
Well, I think that I wasn't thinking about this work at all until I became part of Marion Fuson's Nashville Friends, and we met as an integrated group where exchange students and Black students from Fisk would meet on Friday nights and have informal discussions about literally everything that affected us under the sun, where we came from, what the conditions were like, what life was like to live in a segregated South. We had those kinds of discussions, and then we all washed dishes together and ate foods together. And Mrs. Fuson is actually the one that took us to the First Baptist Church, where Jim Lawson was conducting workshops. And before that, we never knew about the nonviolent workshops. I don't think I'd ever even heard of Gandhi. Okay, I'd heard of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but never Gandhi. Okay, and so we went down to the First Baptist Church, and I heard Jim Lawson speaking that night, and I was very impressed with what he was saying, and then the fact that he was also a student at Divinity School at Vanderbilt. So, I was interested from that point.
So it was sort of not an obvious lightning strike, but a sort of aggregating swell that came up behind you.
Absolutely. It's very slow moving. We hadn't any idea of any kind of, demonstrations or anything that we would be a part of. Didn't even have it in my mind. But it grew on me that, naturally I was conscious of the fact that we had very limited, opportunities when we graduated from college and this kind of stuff, but we hadn't made a decision as to what to do about it.
Well, you speak of inspiring Vanderbilt Divinity School students. So I think the next person who I will ask on this panel is Justin Bautista Jones, who was my student at Fisk and who is currently a Vanderbilt Divinity School student who is carrying on the mantle of this work in Nashville in the present. Justin, what about you? A catalyzing moment or person?
Yeah, I think for me, it was both. I think one of my first activism teachers, theology teachers, nonviolent action teachers is my grandma Harriet, whose family left the South and moved to the South side of Chicago before moving to the Bay Area where I grew up. And this is someone who always taught me the importance of lifting up others and kind of, reaching backward and not forgetting why we do this work and our ancestry, and as well as the future generations that are coming after. But for me, the event that really catalyzed me was Trayvon Martin's death. I was born in Oakland, and I was 17 when Trayvon Martin was killed, when George Zimmerman was found did not get penalized for that murder. And growing up, in the Bay Area, I just knew that same gun violence that killed Trayvon could not be separated from the stories that I heard growing up of Oscar Grant and other issues of police brutality in my community. And so I went to a high school, was president of the Black Student Union, and saw these systems of white supremacy even at play when we look at the school to prison pipeline. In high school, I boycotted attending graduation because of the issue of retaliation from our administration against students who spoke out against systemic racism in our school district. And so just always felt that call and was encouraged again by my grandma Harriet and other relatives to step into that power and to also be willing to take the risk that comes with that, but to never to either stand for something or fall for everything. And then finally, of course, going to Fisk, you cannot go to Fisk and not know about our legacy of liberation and not feel that spirit when you walk on that campus of what has brought America forward to where we are this far on the journey, and to kind of pick up that torch and continue carrying it as we look forward. So those are just some of the brief things that inspired my journey.
Thank you so much, Justin. Charlane, would you like to weigh in on this catalyzing person or event or cumulative moment or cumulative series?
Yeah. So for me, coming out of college, I went to Vanderbilt. So when I was in school, I wasn't thinking about social justice. I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, which I didn't really find out until I was about 30 years old. And so coming out of college, I realized that I had a passion and a bleeding heart for, the underserved. And so I entered the nonprofit space. But all of the positions that I've had and all of the work that I had done up until this point was seeing the world from a lens of charity. And so I've worked for several different nonprofits that provided direct services. I even worked for the state of Tennessee, at the food stamp office, right, as a caseworker. And I never really just questioned the conditions that people were in until Trayvon Martin's death impacted me. I was about 30 years old and had already had my daughter. And I was pregnant with my son, my second child. I have 3 children now. And my son, Elijah, was born 2 days before Trayvon Martin was killed. And so it was very, very fresh on my mind that I am birthing a son, and his death resonated with me so much. It radicalized me, basically, in the sense that now I'm sitting here like, how is it that George Zimmerman gets off and walks free and is arrogant about it at that? And so it really angered me, and I really wanted to do something about that. The Trayvon Martin death was the Emmett Till of our time, and if that didn't call you to justice, I question your soul. And so that for me was the moment where I started questioning, how do I get off the sidelines? How do I channel this anger? And it was Mike Brown's death. It was Philando Castile's death. It was Sandra Bland's death. All of these Black Lives Matter uprisings and deaths at the hands of police that was the progression for me. It started with Trayvon, and I've continued to really channel that anger into the Equity Alliance work and seeing, how do we get at the systems? How do we strike at the heart of what these systems represent? And how do we dismantle them? And so that's the work that I'm doing today. And so I just uplift Trayvon and his family because his death started a movement.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm moved to hear Trayvon Martin's name called out twice. It's striking to me to hear it because I think it happened during a very different administrative system from the top. And I think at the time when I was watching, I was thinking, this evil must be called to account. But I also was thinking, I was receiving it from a position of thinking there was sanity at the top, which felt different from the sort of hard pivot that we had in 2016 to remind us all of the hard things about where we began as a country. And then the radical shifts that have subsequently unfolded in both directions from that. But Jamil, what about you, the catalyzing? I think we have to hear this answer from everybody because we need to know. Origin stories are so important. So for you, a catalyzing person or event that sent you into the heart and soul of this work?
Yes. essentially, of course, I'm coming at it from a different perspective as that of a journalist. And so I came into media work through a number of different inspirations, many of whom spoke truth to power. But I came basically to when I'm now a writer, I'm now a columnist. I came into this space because, frankly, I remembered the inspiration that I had as a young person, long before these injustices. And I had a cousin who was murdered, and there was nothing in the paper about him. There was nothing about the case. There was nothing about him being missing. There was just his story wasn't told. It wasn't important to this press, or it wasn't seen. And so what I thought was, this is an avenue for my passion for writing and my passion for storytelling, that where I can be useful in the world and increase, as one of my former bosses put it, increase the amount of useful information in the world. And certainly when Trayvon was killed, I was happened to be working for a television program that was the first to put it on cable news and make sure that people started talking about it. To me, there has to be in the essence, not just of talking about what we're going to be talking about, what happens to us and all the injustices that befall us, but we have to talk about the accountability and enhancing the structures for accountability. And I think it's all, it's on us in the press to press for that accountability.
That's right. I think it took me a long time to get right with the idea that if I was going to be an activist, my best way was still to sit in my house and figure out how to put my words together right, like my mother always told me I was supposed to do. But I think that is one of the ways that we wield powers with the pen, with accurate, authentic truth-telling. And so I think that, knowing that that's your role in the work is really powerful. And obviously, Reverend Lawson, this part of the conversation would not be complete without knowing where you began with this work. If there is a catalyzing incident or person, can you share that with us?
Very easily. I grew up in a very fine environment in Massillon, Ohio. In many ways desegregated, with a great parents, mother and father a pastor, and a wonderful congregation that loved me from age 4. And on Tremont Street, one of my white playmates around my own age suddenly uses racist terms on me. I'm 4 years old. I turn around and slap him. We are playmates, about the same age. We lived in a thoroughly desegregated residential section of Massillon, where Black folk made up about 10% of the population. Well, that 4-year-old experience stuck with me now for 90 years, and I have pushed at the fact that a society pushing racism, sexism, violence, what I call plantation capitalism, is a society that desperately needs transformation, social, economic, political, spiritual change, revolution.
Thank you for sharing that recollection. It's reminiscent to me of, I think we all remember the first time we read Souls of Black Folk. And, when Dr. Du Bois talks about when the veil first fell, it was also at school with a white friend being ugly, right? And I think that those moments when you realize that Black childhood innocence is at the mercy of the limits of white children's imaginations, that can be a really, and my story would probably start somewhere like that too. And I'm so grateful to you for your testimony about that. So my next question, and this is a really complicated and important one, because you hear this term gaslighting so much right now, and so much of the sort of truncated work of what the part of the work that Dr. King was doing, in the 50s and 60s, and then people thinking that was a contained artifact in and of itself, and not understanding that it extends into the present, because laws technically were changed, even though society's limitations and implicit bias and the fallout from centuries of systemic oppression remain. So after all of the blood, sweat, and tears, for example, here in Nashville, the lunch counters finally were integrated with a stroke of Mayor Ben West's pen. Unshackling America from bonds of ingrained and systemic racism requires, though, more than any single executive action. Is it now harder to explain what racial justice means and what victory looks like? I know that's a
Yes.
big.
Of course it's up.
Okay, so would you please say more? I know we'd be grateful.
Well, the United States of America has never paid attention to itself. It has made lofty ideas, but those ideas never applied to ourselves. So, for an example, police in London never carried guns when I first visited there in 1953. United States history has never considered the possibility that you could have law enforcement without police carrying weapons. So BLM has, for the first time, put on the public conversation whether or not police with guns, where they have killed more black people and brown people and Indian people than they've killed criminals, if it should be re-examined for a society that seeks to be a society of equal access of every baby boy and girl born, access to equality, liberty, justice, to life itself. So it's more difficult because the nation's never had this kind of a moment. Racism did not permit it. Sexism did not permit it. The conquest of the Indian never permitted a public conversation on the whole picture. And this is what has made a lot of white people anxious and even with a misplaced anger, inauthentic anger, because they're hearing discussions now. They're seeing images such as the society has never had before. I could not see this in the 40s as a high school student, or in the 50s as a college student, or in the 60s, or in the 70s. What we hear going on perhaps has only been true since around maybe the 80s. And the volume of the conversation has massively increased. Unfortunately, a handicap to the conversation is the 74 million people who voted for Trump really not knowing what that vote represented or represents. That's the enormous issue facing the United States today. 74 million people who voted to re-elect Trump, a man who has violated all his life's fundamental ethical standards around the issue of gender, race, religion, violence, and above all, business life.
I hope that they didn't know what they were doing. I'm a little bit more cynical and think that they might have known. I think that fear and lack of self-examination are a potent brew for sort of doubling down on your grip on power. And I think, and for finding reasons to keep people out. I think that people are afraid if they acknowledge what's been done to people of color in this country, women in this country, people who feel othered in this country in any way. If they acknowledge what's been done in the name of white supremacy, they fear that we'll want retribution instead of equity. Because that's what they would want, because their imaginations are limited. And I think that makes, it makes the fortresses frighteningly impenetrable seeming sometimes. But I want to ask, I think that part of my question comes to this, when schools are segregated and you say, well, separate is not equal. And so if Black kids can't go to white school, then you change that law. And then now what do you do when the schools are still not equal? Because they've said that they fixed the law. How does it change the work that we've got to do that they think that on paper they fixed things? Is that Justin? I see you nodding, and then Jamil, Jamil, did you want to? I'll let y'all do.
Well, I mean, just to that point, I think that, first to, Dr. Lawson's point, I mean, I'm not sure whether or not they knew what they were doing, but what's evident is that they didn't care. And that to me is the most dangerous thing. And if we have an entire population of people, nearly half the country's voters, don't care about the effect of their vote, don't care how, another 4 years of this man, how much damage that could do to marginalized and underserved populations, then frankly that's a fundamental problem with the American project. And we see the party that supported that man essentially try to mutate and maim the purposes of democracy any chance they get. So my contention on that is we have to simply think about how to get around and through people like that. And we spend a little bit too much time, I think, in our politics worried about unifying and keeping peace and all that. And my worry with that is that in doing so, we allow these people to get away with it. We allow people to get away with because we live in a society that lives on likes and all that stuff on social media. I mean, people love to get credit for the very least thing that they have done. So if they posted a black square on Instagram, or they've given some money to a charity, or they watch a certain documentary, they want credit for that. It's just that's not the work, and we need to get people to understand that.
Yeah, I think performative allyship is a real problem. But then the other question, and Justin, I'm going to hand it to you, and then I would love to hear from Charlane and Angeline as well. There's a difference between dogs and whistles and dog whistles, right? And I think one you can take a picture of and point to, and the other one you have to know how to hear in order to explain and combat, right? And I think we're in this strange position now where we have to, even allies, they'll say, I believe you, but I don't understand you, right? Because they can't hear what we heard, right? And so I think we're navigating this. How is the work? How does that change the work? The fact that even the allies can't always see what we see and hear what we hear because it's dog whistles and not dogs and whistles, right? Is that or is that a distinction without a worthy difference moving forward? And Angeline, did I see your hand go up? Or are you wanting to leap in real quick?
Yeah, but it's not to the question that you're asking at the moment about the dog whistles and stuff. It's the statement you made previously to Jamil's comments about segregation laws being changed, and yet basically nothing happening. Okay, what happens, when the law is changed on the books? Okay, I went through the South because I'm from South Carolina. Okay, so my state was just as bad as Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and the rest of them. Okay, so I went to a rural school, and I did not leave, South Carolina until 57 to go to college, and nothing had changed. Absolutely nothing. There were no desegregated schools, even though the law passed in 54. And by the time we got to Nashville, and by the time we met Jim Lawson, okay, and Kelly Miller Smith, and SCLC, and Nashville Christian Leadership Conference, who had been working on desegregating the schools, well, Roy Campanella said only 6% of desegregation had happened in the South, and at the rate they were going, it was going to take 94 more years. Because the states went on the prevention kick. You understand? And so they were determined not to do anything. So everything became a legal case again.
And it made
Whether
it
it's Little Rock, Little Rock 9 or whatever, they came.
And in some ways, it's almost a harder legal case because it's now case by case instead of
a
blanket item to deal with. Justin, did you want to leap in?
Yeah, I just wanted to, about your question about like just the difference of like our movement now without such blatant signs. Like I was downtown today here in Nashville and was down, and we, have a whole restaurant that honors the Nashville sit-ins, and so we really celebrate this history. We have a lot of symbolism around this. But one thing that I often hear as an organizer here in the city today is, why don't you do it like, Lawson and John Lewis and Diane Nash? When we were protesting this summer, we spent 62 days in a sit-in outside the Capitol, and they said, that we should do it like how it was done in the past. And so I think it's interesting that we love to celebrate movements when they're over or when those campaigns are over. But in the midst of it, even, some of our allies are saying, I support what you're doing, but I don't support you. For example, they didn't support us saying Black Lives Matter. They didn't support us, maybe when we protest in the street because it blocks traffic. And so there's all these critiques and all this type of pitting generations against each other. And the interesting thing is that, particularly in Nashville, we have a lot of symbolic, we have monuments, we have paintings, we have all these things that celebrate the civil rights movement and the Black freedom, liberation movement, as if like it's over, and neglect the fact that in Nashville, 37208 is one of the most incarcerated zip codes in the nation. We neglect the fact that here in Tennessee, we haven't expanded healthcare, which disproportionately impacts Black Tennesseans. We neglect the fact that we have less voting rights protections today than we did prior to 1965 because we have voter ID laws and laws that seek to criminalize voter registration and all these things that, like Charlane has been fighting with the Equity Alliance. When I was at the legislature today, we still have these overt, white supremacists, those who are defending a statue of a grand witch of the KKK, but we also have the more dangerous ones, which are the more sophisticated, white supremacists who are seeking to, put right to work, quote unquote, in our state constitution as we speak, or who are trying to make it a felony if you protest certain ways in our state. And so I just think all these things make it so much harder to wrap our arms around it, where without having those colored and white signs, without having this blatant symbolism, I think a lot of people have gotten comfortable. And even, I had hope in the summertime when we had these massive uprisings, including here in Nashville. And it just seems like a lot of the energy has faded away very quickly with, even with Biden coming to office, I think people feel more comfortable. So I think Trump was a catalytic force that kind of shook people awake. He put the white sheets back on, and now that that's gone, I think, for some people, it's back to business as normal. And I think that should trouble us, and it should force us to, again, to be the agitators who's trying to disrupt that narrative that these attacks like we saw this week against our Asian community is something that's new. But this is, in fact, who America has always been from the time it stole this land from the indigenous people, enslaved African Americans, and, demonized everyone else who came over who wasn't a white European male Protestant.
That's right. I think it's like any infection. If you don't take the whole round of antibiotics, then you stop taking the medicine when you think that you feel better. That's how superbugs get born. That's how we get antibiotic resistant strains of diseases. I think what we're dealing with now is some kind of weird antibiotic resistant strain that people thought it was a little bit better, and now it's just gone underground and embedded itself in our bones in some really terrifying ways. Reverend Lawson, and then Charlane, I know you've got to weigh in on this too. Reverend Lawson, did you?
Well, yeah, I just want to go back to some of the earlier comments about, did Trump supporters know what they were doing, and this notion of gaslighting. Like, I think, heck yeah, they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were voting for, especially when we saw 4 years of Trumpism, and what he did was scapegoat every person of color, every poor person. If you were not a white man, you were on the chopping block. And so for 73 million people, more people that voted in 2020 than in 2016, more people dug into their heels and said, yes, we want more of that. They knew exactly what they were voting for. And so we're at this critical juncture that racism doesn't exist and look like what it used to. It was very covert. It was the lynchings. It was the dragging behind the truck. It was the torture, right? We don't see that today. And so racism has gotten so sophisticated that white people like to gaslight us as if it's like, oh yeah, you got your civil rights in 1964. You can vote. Just go to the polls. But they don't see the sheer precision at which our politicians take a scalpel to voting rights and have carved us out, how they have taken a scalpel to healthcare. Look at what has happened in this pandemic, and where Black people are being disproportionately impacted because we don't have healthcare. We can't afford it. We're at the bottom in terms of jobs, in terms of we're the essential workers, we're the hourly workers. And so it has just taken a different form. And white people have to be the ones to really look inwardly to say, okay, this is on us to fix. So I think we have to look at the policy. Why, and you asked the question, Caroline, why are our schools, we had, Brown versus Board of Education, but our schools are still underfunded because it comes down to money. It comes down to where in our society are we funding legislation? Where are we funding the policies? And a lot of these policies are designed to strip us as Black folks, as people of color, out of society. And they're doing it through policy.
Yes, I'd like to respond here.
Please do, please.
You cannot eradicate 400 years of Western exploration of the earth, 600 years rather, which included racism and sexism. You cannot eliminate that in then 20 years. Period. The second thing I want to say is that to be human is to be an extremely complicated piece of life, not easily comprehended by simple slogans. We have 74 million people who voted for the continuation of their poverty, of their racism, of their sexism, of their support of varying kinds of violence, of their willingness to be controlled by plantation capitalism. They are humanly illiterate. And
That's
they do not
extraordinary.
know. They do not know that they are humanly, female and male, illiterate.
Mm.
And as one Western writer said, they are angry at being born to be human, which is the major journey each one of us has without exception. So I'm going to stand for the fact that it was a movement of Black people that brought us to this moment. The Nonviolent Campaign, 1953 to 1973, where Angelina and I were together, colleagues in Nashville, Tennessee, for maybe 3 or 4 years, doing all sorts of demonstrations against this stuff. It was we Black folk who began rising up in the 20th century to say, this country under God will not become a racist, segregationist power base. We will fight it. We will resist it. And so that task of we, the Black people of the country, continuing to organize like the BLM movement in the 21st century, is a major responsibility of all who want change. And that change does not come overnight because it's human and it takes it. Evolution in human life is a principle that science has a complete consensus on. You know, some people did not like the notion back in the 1850s or so, or 70s, when Charles Darwin presented a theory. But evolution, as a part of the way in which we human beings learn and grow and become alive, is, in my own judgment as a theologian, an undoubted way in which the universe works. A baby born is not a 12-year-old. And a 12-year-old doesn't have the brain capacity of a 29-year-old. So that human journey is critical, and many of our fellow citizens have been prevented from that human journey by racism and sexism and violence and the unjust influence of big landowners, big corporations. And our movement has done more to help us wake up and to help our nation wake up at the present moment than any other movement. So the big task in my mind is how we continue the Black struggle for equality, liberty, justice, and the beloved community. That's the big issue facing Black folk. How do we continue it?
Well, and I think it's not just facing Black folk now, it's facing decent, sane Americans. I think, as Charlane was pointing out, it's going to take white people getting involved too this time around. I think that, you think about of people, as the Black indigenous people of color in this country, we're indigenous involuntarily, right? I think like my ancestors from Africa did not choose to be here. And we are here, and I am a Black indigenous person of color in this country. And I think that the work that America has to do to fulfill the spirit of this our beloved founding documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, is, as Black people, we're the ones that get to demand that these documents live up to things that they didn't even know they meant, right? And so it's this work of will and imagination, and people who believe in the idea of America and who accept that we are citizens. Everyone has to turn their mind to figuring out how every American citizen gets access to the promises of the founding documents, right? And I think that our continual relentless demand that the documents live up to their word and that our fellow citizens stand by us as we ask the documents to live up to their word to us too. That's the work, and white people have to do it too, because only white people can model how to be good white people. And even I can ask white people to be good white people, but I can't show them how to do it because I'm a good Black person. We need good white people to model how to be good white people, and that's part of the shift in the work, I think, right now, and it's an exciting shift in the work. And I think, and just as we talk about believing in science and the truth and evolution, one thing I want to say before I move on to the next question is, as we sit here, every one of us on this panel, our scientific life expectancy has dropped by 3 years in the last year. Every one of us. Our white friends that are watching this, like, y'all's has only dropped by 1. And that is as plain as day, the trouble with this place that we live. That you could be one color as a citizen of a country and have your life expectancy drop by 3 years because of the malignant neglect of a regime that doesn't care about your life. And you can be another color and have your life expectancy only drop by 1, and that's only averages because you had to factor in our numbers, our too hard numbers. And so I'm just laying that on the table as we move forward, because the things that y'all said inspired me to speak some truth in this space right now. And then celebrating where we are in cyberspace today in Nashville, Tennessee, Dr. Martin Luther King, called the Nashville movement the best organized and most disciplined in the Southland. Is it fair to y'all to say that the leadership of the movement today is more diffuse? And if so, does that make it harder to advance a broad racial justice agenda? Leadership being more diffuse, does that make it harder to broadcast a racial justice agenda? And is the leadership more diffuse or not? And I will say, let's do a lightning round because we've got limited time left, and I want to hear from everybody. And I also want to ask one more question. So I'm going to beg everyone 2 minutes for answers. And I'm just going to go straight across on my delightful panelist grid. And I'm going to turn it over to Angeline first.
Okay,
Tell me.
I'll take it. I'll take it. Just right there. Okay, diffuse or not diffuse. To me, that's not the issue. Okay. I have to go back to the question you originally asked, like what brought me to the movement and those workshops that I attended that Jim Lawson was teaching. Okay, I'm an actress like you are, a poet and all of that. Okay, and so I have a certain interest in like role enactment and a whole number. And in our workshops, one of the things that we were doing after the talks about Gandhi and Thoreau and King and Montgomery is that we role played. We role played an as if situation. Okay, so a lot of the ministers that were there, like Metz Rollin, or people like Marion Barry, they would play the white people, and like we would sit in front and be the black people at the counter, okay, or the black people that they encountered. So we role played, and that was very exciting because they would push us off the chairs. They would call us terrible, slanderous names and niggers and all those kind of words that we hate. Okay, but after we did that, there was now a calm discussion as to how we reacted to that. This is the pre-training, okay? The pre-preparation for going downtown, okay? And then the next thing is you go downtown on a real test demonstration. And now some real white people are yelling at you across the counter, and they're throwing things at you, and they're harassing you in a whole number, and you can't do anything about it. But you're feeling this, and now, they close the store on you, so you got to leave. And now you come back to the workshops, and there's Jim Lawson, and there's C.T. Vivian, and there's, the ministers, and they are asking us, well, how did you react? What did you feel? What did you want to do? They are now still analyzing what are our feelings of putting ourselves in that situation. We're in training. You understand? And then now, we're looking at, well, what could we have done differently? How could we have controlled our anger? Because we know this is going to happen if we demonstrate, whether we're picketing, whether we're sitting in, whether we're freedom riding or whatever. We know there's going to be agitation. There may be beatings. There may be killings. There may be, so what if, this had happened? How are you feeling about this? What would you do? What can you do and what can't you not do? Okay. So we went through all of that role playing in these workshops. Now you can imagine me with an actor's instinct. I'm very interested in that, right? It may not be political for me. It may be because, this is just, this is creative. You understand? And it's making me understand something that I never knew. And I'm interested in that new idea as well, because like I said, I had never heard of Gandhi. I hadn't heard of Thoreau. I barely had heard of Montgomery, but I was a distance away. You understand? So I didn't know the details. You said 2 minutes. So reenactment of role playing, and then that business of discussing, how to psychologically deal with your own anger that was inside of you was a very big part of the discussion. Okay. So by the time we did that in 59 for several months, we went home for the break and we came back. And now we were interested in those workshops again, right? And now we're setting up a central committee. And the rest is history.
It's amazing. And I think I love that, what I'm hearing you say in some ways is that, there's genuine just intellectual curiosity about the undertaking of a work of any kind of significance, one. And then two, there's also, I know in my life as a creative, any good art is an empathy exercise. And sort of the anticipating of what you're going to receive and how it will be received, and imagining that act of imagination that you sort of engage with regardless of what the art that you're making is. And life is also art. A life well lived is artful too. So I think I really appreciate the artist's lens on the work, the way you've described it there. And so I'm going to turn it now to Chandra and say, for you, is the movement more diffuse to you? And what does that tell us about our leadership? Or is it not diffuse? Is it just differently composed? What do you think?
I think you meant Charlane. That's okay. So diffuse, sure, in the sense that technology has allowed the movement to become more far-reaching, because we're able to take our movements online and speak to a large swath of people. But I think in the sense of diffuse being unorganized, absolutely not. I think we are more united than ever. Our movement for Black liberation is more united than ever, because as we're seeing, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks being discriminated against, in certain different ways, we have but one oppressor, and that is white supremacy, and we are all uniting around that wherever we are in the world. And I think our movement is more diverse today, because we have social justice leaders like Justin Jones, who is still in his 20s, and then you have movement leaders like myself who are in my 30s, but then we have Dr. Lawson, who is on this panel, who has had decades of experience. And so we have all these combined voices speaking out against injustice, and it looks different, but it is more united than ever.
Thank you. And again, Charlane, I apologize. Thank you for speaking your truth to power. And I think I like what you brought up about, the not just social media, but the new platforms. I think that it actually makes us more united because we actually are able to sit on our computers face to face with our brothers and sisters in California, and make plans in different ways. I feel like I get to follow, say, Stacey Abrams from my pen and my computer. I'm sitting in Tennessee and I get to, march with her and support her in Georgia. I think about things like that and it makes me feel connected, I hope, and not diffuse. But Jamil, what do you think about this question of the way that the movement has evolved given technology and time, about the leadership and how it functions differently or not?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we in the younger generation have a mistaken idea of what leadership looked like in those days. I mean, we were taught in school that, there was Dr. King, and maybe we're taught that there was Malcolm X, and maybe we're taught about Fannie Lou Hamer or, a couple other folks, but we did not learn about all of these, movements, these separate movements, these local, pushes for civil rights. We didn't learn about the Nashville sit-ins in school, and I went to a pretty good university. So my thought is, we need to first understand our past a lot better. We need to understand exactly the kinds of leadership that actually existed before we can really start to judge how different or how similar things are. I think really the key is, frankly, for folks who were there to look at what's happening now and to judge. And I think if there is anything, I'll just say this, that technology has it's allowed people to organize much faster. Certainly from a practical standpoint, people are able to gather at, Union Square or, Grant Park or wherever you may be in whatever city that you are trying to rally at. You are able to assemble people much faster via the internet than perhaps, you might have, via calls and, other forms of word of mouth.
I love that. You have to look to the past to know where we're going, to understand the foundations. That's so valuable. Justin, I want to just move straight to you without preamble.
Yeah. I think one thing about this time that I'm noticing is that we live in a time of a lot of urgency where it seems like so much is urgent. I mean, this past year alone, we've seen the need for mass mobilization for a number of causes, whether it was police killings of people, our brothers like George Floyd, our sisters like Breonna Taylor, or whether it was this pandemic where we have, disproportionately impacting our communities and we don't see a very good response from our government officials, or whether it was environmental degradation where we had, the sun in California turn red, we had snow blizzards in Texas and the South. And so all these things are spread out. And I think what I'm seeing about the movement today is that it has to be more intersectional, and that our definition of leadership has changed. And I think that is to our benefit, because I think that our opponents are diffuse. White supremacy is diffuse. What Dr. Lawson calls plantation capitalism is diffuse, and it's all over, and it's sophisticated and subtle, and it's also overt and ever present. And so I think what we're faced with is a situation where we have to recognize the urgency. And I think the balance that I'm struggling with right now more so is what does urgency look like in a time where we can still be strategic and we don't get burnt out, or we don't feel like we're constantly responding. We just had, murders of our Asian, residents in Georgia. And so we see that issue coming up. And then, a few weeks ago, we were dealing with white supremacists storming the Capitol. And then before that, we had, people trying to throw out black votes in Georgia. So it's always something happening that's urgent. And so my struggle I'm seeing right now for our movement is how do we stay concentrated? How do we sustain pressure in a way that is not just operating according to media cycles that change every, 48 hours and then forget about, what's going on. And then our attention is shifted. And that's, I think, the biggest concern that we're facing, even in terms of sustaining the pressure that we saw this summer with, over 4,000 demonstrations across the nation, one of the largest movements, in a while. And yet that type of sustained pressure is kind of fizzled out in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's white supremacy is diffuse. That's the line that's going to stick with me, sir. Thank you. Reverend Lawson, I want to give you the last word on this question. If you want to weigh in on the question of the diffuse or changing nature of the movement, of the leadership in the current times.
Well, the most important issue is that in the process of evolutionary change, the audience has become larger,
Mm-hmm.
and the leadership has become more diverse than ever before. The academy has rarely caused a movement to take place in the United States, but the BLM network is a network that has great leadership out of faculty people of universities. That is a wonderful evolutionary change. The leadership also of the Black Lives Matter, the founders were all women. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't have women in Montgomery or Nashville. Angelina was our youngest student. She was a very strong person from the beginning in our central committee that ran the movement in Nashville for some 5 or 6 years. So you don't get from 1910 to 2021 without a great variety of people and events and intellectual ideas and artistic forces and religious forces in the mix. And so I still think that a major vocation of being alive is the problem of studying and thinking and reading and having conversations and learning and stretching our minds and our hearts and our experience. So the movement is at a very significant place right now out of 2020. And I anticipate that the century 2021 is going to be even more impactful than we've ever imagined.
Thank you so much, Reverend Lawson. That wish from your mouth to the ears of whoever you believe in, who's above or beyond or around us or within us. And on that note, I'm going to thank the panelists, but first I just want to share what I would call a secularly sacred meditation by the poet Lucille Clifton, who I think sustains many of us as we come to this work. The poem is called "Won't You Celebrate With Me?" Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up, here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. This is a group of people who survive, who go every day into the fray. I am so honored to share this space with all of you. I am so grateful to all of you for having had this conversation in the city of my ancestors, in the city where you've made history and will continue to make history. And as Reverend Lawson has said, be more impactful. And on behalf of Vanderbilt, I am so, so happy to have been able to hold this space with you.
Thank you so much.